If a deaf person was telling a story from their perspective, and they were also telling about another perspective and comparing the two, the interpreter would miss which perspective the deaf person was talking about. A narrative in spoken language, there are 7 different levels of speaking in narrative. It seems through consecutive interpreting, the full concept is grasped, while through simultaneous interpreting, a lot of important concepts were missed, and interpreters tended to focus on the explanations and the details, like what a house would look like, when the important events that happened were missing from the interpretation. So that's a problem. During consecutive interpreting, things were different. During consecutive interpreting, it was successful because they could receive the message analyze it fully for full understanding and express it more accurately. It seemed the interpreters during simultaneous interpreting, the question and answers weren't matching. There would be a question and the answer didn't match the question that was asked. During consecutive, there was a greater connection between the question and answer. The full context, everything involved in the question, before and during, was more accurate during consecutive interpreting. Also, affect, the emotion involved during the story, that was also more included with consecutive interpreting. And finally, it seems the ASL prosody, which means when you watch the interpreter using natural ASL features like facial expression, and it would come across more natural than in simultaneous interpreting. Studies show that during a deaf person's testimony, you should use consecutive interpreting if you want to be more accurate. During a cross-examination, when the lawyer is questioning, you can use both simultaneous and consecutive interpreting, because the information is information that they've been exposed to before. If there's a new question or some new information, you should use consecutive interpreting. For the expert witness, you should use both consecutive and simultaneous interpreting, because sometimes there's a lot of highly technical words and details and vocabulary that needs to be understood fully before expressing it. If you use consecutive interpreting, the errors are reduced and the contact sign is reduced as well. There's more of an ASL structure to the sign language. After my study was done, I wondered how consecutive interpreting is being taught. I did a study on 15 interpreter education programs in Canada, and I asked how they were teaching consecutive interpreting. Were they teaching it from the beginning? Some were teaching it from the beginning, or were they learning it throughout the entire course? It seems all of the 15 programs answered yes to that they were teaching consecutive interpreting, but how they taught it differed greatly. Sometimes a program would teach consecutive interpreting during the first semester as an introduction, and after that focus on simultaneous interpreting, and they wouldn't discuss consecutive interpreting anymore after that. Some programs had consecutive interpreting consistently, but with a different philosophy. In the programs, I interviewed students, and it seems that students who took consecutive interpreting wanted to go out and practice it. They wanted to use it. But when they would encounter a mentor, the mentor would tell them, oh no, that's not in the real world, that's in school. So there wasn't any support. Some of the teachers admitted to using consecutive interpreting in their practice, but they didn't show the students during their class. So it's interesting how in our field there are a lot of different answers in regards to consecutive interpreting. Some people are supportive of it and some are against it. They feel simultaneous interpreting is best. Some interpreters are against it and some interpreters support it. It's a variety of responses. Some interpreters have asked me, suppose I take consecutive interpreting, how do I use it? Well, in my work, I use consecutive interpreting in many places. During court, a legal interview, a psychology appointment, counseling or medical application, in education, discussing one-on-one with a student, or even in a small group, you can use consecutive interpreting. If the information is a question and answer or a discussion, I can use consecutive interpreting as well. I asked interpreters how they use consecutive interpreting or when they decide to use it. If the information is very complex, if there's a lot of details, they tend to use consecutive interpreting because it's a lot to retain. So by taking notes, they're ready to interpret. With children, I prefer to use consecutive interpreting with children or elderly. Maybe they need more time, or maybe I need more time to analyze their language. If someone moves here from another country and their sign language is not ASL, they have another sign language or no sign language, just gestures, I would use consecutive interpreting then. If there's a situation where, as the interpreter, my errors could destroy someone's life, court, medical, if my errors could impact the client greatly, and I definitely want to go slower and use consecutive interpreting. Suppose an interpreter is new to a situation, there's no context, there's no information about what's occurred before or after what the situation is. That's a good time for consecutive interpreting. It gives you time to think and understand the situation. If using consecutive interpreting and simultaneous interpreting, does that mean you need to pick one and stick with it? Any situation, any assignment, you can use both. For example, in a police interview, the open interview part, I know what the police is going to ask, how old the person is, their name, where they work, and so that lends itself to simultaneous. But when the police officer interviews the person about a car accident or something serious with a lot of explaining, I can't predict the answers, so I'm going to need more time to wait and have consecutive interpreting. So that means I use simultaneous and consecutive interpreting during one assignment. So if you want to learn about consecutive interpreting, you have to be honest about your work and your beliefs about simultaneous interpreting versus consecutive. You have to go back and look at your language accuracy and just have discussions with deaf people and hearing people about your work. And if there's a lot of proof showing there are more errors with simultaneous and consecutive interpreting is more accurate. So have these discussions with people in your profession, in your fields. With deaf interpreters, hearing interpreters, working as a team, the team needs to learn how to use consecutive interpreting.